Challenges arising from the pandemic in maintaining paradigms. Brazilian Society of Geriatrics and Gerontology. Good morning to all who support us. I am Ivete BERKENBROCK, actually President of Brazilian Society of Geriatrics and Gerontology. On behalf of the SBGG, I congratulate the organizers of this conference and congratulate the organization and scientific program of the same. In this symposium, we will talk a little about the challenge faced in Brazil as a result of the terrible pandemic COVID-19 that somehow affected all of us personally and or professionally. We appreciate the opportunity and wish you all a good conference. Now I introduce our speakers. The first is Carlos André UEHARA, with the theme New Forms of Communication in the Pandemic Context. Dr. Carlos is geriatrician and past president of Brazilian Society of Geriatrics and Gerontology. In sequência, Vaniá HEREDIA, with the theme Different Faces of Violence Against the Elderly as Forms of Aging. Dr. Vaniá is sociologist, coordinator of the research group on aging studies at the University of Caxias do Sul, Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. And she is past president of the Department of Gerontology of the Brazilian Society of Geriatrics and Gerontology. And the last, Dr. Simone FIEBRANTZ PINTO, with the theme, Ways to Take Care of New Challenges. Dr. Simone is nutritionist and president of the Department of Gerontology of the Brazilian Society of Geriatrics and Gerontology. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to participate in this Congress of Gerontology and Geriatrics, EHG, and in this symposium by different phases of violence in the elderly population as forms of discrimination against the elderly. Violence is one of the major concerns of Brazilian society, and for some years it motivates government's actions to face it. Violence has wide ranges of frequency and materializes in various types of aggression, including negligence and abuse. Shall we indicate that violence consists of every act of force that acts against someone's nature or against their will and freedom, and in every act that transgresses something positively valued by a society acting against what is determined as fair and as a right. Violence implies a transgression of the power duty to protect adults and society. The present of violence is the denial that the human being has to be treated as a subject. In the same direction, Faleiros postulates that when violence occurs, there is a rupture of the social pact of coexistence, of guaranteeing rights, and of a civilizing mode. Violence is a poor expression of the relationships of social inequality that, according to this author, is based on unequal relationships of power and can only be understood in the context of interpersonal social relationships, groups, class, genders, and also in the structural institutional relationships. The concept of violence present in Brazilian legislation, whose meaning reflects the aggression that any person suffers from another or in other ways. We can say that the period we are experiencing in the pandemic, and which is still in progress, has brought out spontaneous reactions from the general population towards the elderly. One of these reactions is the age discrimination, which ends up being a form of violence because it is marked by irrationality and lack of general acknowledge. Many of these reactions are mitigated as some institutions spoke out in defense of the elderly population. Despite records of age discrimination of the most diverse dimensions, many elderly people are affected by this violence. In this sense, the present presentation brings subsides to this discussion, highlighting mainly the relationship between age discrimination and violence. Three main items will be discussed: the context of the pandemic, the reactions of the Brazilian population towards the elderly, and the health actions and the various forms of declared violence. The COVID-19 pandemic has a devastating impact on the elderly. During the coronavirus pandemic, news and information about the elderly have been dedicated mainly to the fact that this population is the most vulnerable group to the disease and to the importance of care and social isolation for people over 60 years old. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an increase in discriminatory attitudes against the elderly. This due to the demand for health care in this group due to their greater vulnerability to development of more serious forms of the disease and therefore greater need for hospitalization in intensive care units. The reactions in the population in Brazil to actions health is the absence of a coordinated national policy to combat and control the pandemic, which promote a certain denial of the pandemic. The delay in the purchase of vaccines and the indication of treatments of unproven efficacy. The elderly as a risk group and the absence of further explanation about the effects of the pandemic. The guidelines given by the media are not always precise regarding basic care, social distancing, and the search of the health services. Difficulties of the population in general to accept the distancing measures, suspension of face-to-face activities, and contradictory reactions from the elderly population about actually doing isolation. 4. Tensions in family life accumulated by the living conditions of many elderly people increase case of violence. Decrease of formal and informal support that many elderly people receive causing many family tensions. Family and intergenerational conflicts due to this sharing of domestic spaces. Communication difficulties due to the fact that they do not master the virtual means of communication, family, friends, purchase, payments, and the resistance to changing routines to face the pandemic and promote the protection of the most affected groups. Fear of contamination, fear of death, and for last, climate of uncertainty and growing anxieties about the near future, social, economic, family. In this situation, the violence in Brazil is a characteristic already incorporated in the culture. It is accepted as a way of minimizing the contradictions present in society, which have been numerous since its origin. Violence not only as a physical aggression to the individual, but in these various possibilities of manifestations in which it presents itself as a response for the demand that arise from society. In this sense, we use Valeiro's classifications, which divides into intrafamiliar violence, sociopolitical violence, and institutional violence. During the pandemic, the elderly population in the country suffered these three types of violence in a declared way, that is, it was no riding, which means that the aggressors were not worried about the consequence of this. The corona pandemic has increased the volume of complaints that elderly people have suffered in the home environment. Proof of this statement is the increase in record on DL 100, the Canal of National Human Rights. Domestic violence involves, in addition to physical aggression, other forms such as humiliation, disrespect, verbal abuse, offense or words, which mentally affect the heart of the elderly and reinforce the negative stereotype built. The second form is the social political violence that grew during the pandemic was patrimonial or financial violence against the elderly. This portrayed situations where the elderly are financially exploited and there is an illegal takeover of their financial resources and their own assets. Many situations arise from loans that the elderly make in the name of these children or grandchildren and up being deceived and losing in the addition to the lower amount older assets involved. Many records were identified as a form of property violence. This type of violence has been promoted by people in the circle of the coexistence, as well as by strangers. That what has been proven is that they make use of the debilitating health conditions of the elderly and improperly benefit from their researches. Ferreira mentions that in the last year, 9,000 cases of property violence were reported, Most cases involve the use of the senior credit cards, loans, and property transfer. And the violence institutional. In this situation, I conclude with some final remarks. COVID-19 and the social distancing necessary to contain the pandemic have brought to light a series of negative consequences for individual and for life in society, including the increase in violence practiced at home. The elderly affected by this context as one of the most vulnerable groups have suffered constant social discrimination because they are old, which reveals the fragility of public policies and guarantees their rights. It was verified the need of have channels of complaint which allow activating the service of intersectoral networks in the field of health and assisting. And finally, the global reports published by OPAS postulates as a strategy to fight prejudice, not only to improve the legislation that deals with this discrimination, but effectively monitoring in all spheres of power to regulate these policies. Facing aging is a condition for creating a more egalitarian world where social rights are respected and the most vulnerable are protected. It also preaches education action, educational contests in all spheres and interventions of intergenerational contact with a spirit of integration, solidarity, and recognition. I thanks for this space for this study. Thank you.
Hi, it's very nice to be with you. Today we will talk about ways to take care of new challenges in this new paradigm in the pandemic. Let's start. We were very asking for help here in Brazil. The Geriatric and Gerontologic Society asked for help the society, the community, our elderly, and the family. We have problems in the pandemic, and we have to individually look for the problem, accept what happened, but focus to help where we can change this situation. So we have to do something to change and to help our community. So the present of the challenge requires working with others, other societies, other communities to help them to resolve, or drawing support from others to come through them. So we have to do something. We have a lot of fake news that happened in the pandemic time here in Brazil, and we have some, we was asked for develop some guidelines and to informate our community. So we have a site to do these right answers to avoid the fake news. And to help this, we begin to go in the different medias like TVs or social media to help our elderly, our caregivers, and the others public to understand what happened in the coronavirus situation. So we talk with the community and avoid the fake news. We have also a partnership with the Choose Wisely Brazil and Choose Wisely International, with the Brazilian Society, Geriatry and Gerontology Society, for general recommendations to the community, especially for in the beginning to make the elderly stay home, to stay safely, and to use the telemedicine for checkup and for when they have mild symptoms of the coronavirus, so they can stay home and safely. We have also some orientations for the elderly and for the caregivers for maintaining mental and physical health during all the lockdown time that was very long, especially for the elderly. We also do some recommendations at the social media all the time to help them being very healthy during the lockdown, especially the prevention of falls that could happen at home. So we are attentive for that too. We have also the protagonism, and we are asked to support, to contribute with different guidelines, for example, pharmacotherapy treatment for the coronavirus disease, with different organizations like medical societies and non-governmental organizations. So we have to support them about this. We also have some problems here in Brazil with the advance of the disease, coronavirus disease. When the growing of numbers of cases is extended, we had to make a guideline for the intensive unit care, because we have sold out places sometimes for the intensive unit care. And we have problems in Brazil because some ICU do not want to admit elderly people. And then this problem about the ageism. And this ageism problem, we want to avoid the chronological age for the admission. So we have to do some guidelines to be very important for the admission of the elderly. We have other problems, for example, when we saw on the media the problem in Europe and North America with the nurses' home, when before the coronavirus diseases started in Brazil, we have, for example, Carlo that is a geriatric here in Brazilian Society, Geriatric and Gerontology Society. She make a role very important because she create a task force to help others nurses' homes, others people who work with nursing home to prevent the big problem, the same that we have in Europe and North America. So they have, leader by Carlo Giacomini, we solve this problem, and they together with the Geriatric Gerontology Society, we create a national task force to help nursing homes and don't have the same problems that we had in Europe and North America, for example. And when the vaccines arrive, we have to do some campaign for all the elderly for get the shot for the coronavirus vaccine, but also for the influenza vaccine. The first shot, the second shot, the third shot, and the fourth shot for the coronavirus. And they, during all the period of the pandemic, we are in the social media and different kind of medias to avoid also fake news, because some elderly don't want to be vaccines. So we are all the time on the media for do the right answers and invite them to be vaccinated. And we also have some problems with ageism. So to avoid this, we stimulate also intergenerational actions. For example, different medias, and also to write letters for his grandmother, for example, grandfather, so we can change and ask for help in avoid the ageism. This was some actions that we did for avoid the ageism and to resolve the problems that appear with the pandemic. So we can, with this, we help the caregivers, the elderly, the families, and all the geriatric and gerontology society. I want to remember that we are not an island unto yourself. We live in community and we flourish best, not isolate individual, but as people embedded in supportive community. So we bring for you some of the actions that the Geriatric and Gerontology Society did this period, and we want to thank you your time. Thank you.
Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Carlos André UEHARA. I am a geriatrician from Brazil and past president of the Brazilian Society of Geriatrics and Gerontology. First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizers of the 22nd World Congress of Gerontology and Geriatrics. The past 3 days were full of knowledge and professional actualization. I was invited to talk about the main challenges of the Brazilian Society of Gerontology and Geriatrics during the COVID-19 pandemic and how we overcome the distrust and the infodemia using new forms of communication in the pandemic context. It was through communication that the human beings were able to accumulate knowledge and transmit information from generation to generation. The act of communicating is an essential activity for life in society, for survival, happiness, personal and professional fulfillment, and success for anyone. Communication basically consists of transmitting a message that can express an idea, exchange information, thoughts, emotions, feelings, or experiences between a sender and one or more receivers. through speech signals, writing, behavior, or another means or channel that generates an objective or subjective reaction, because in the later, it is difficult to quantify the results. And the importance of communication is here: create awareness to fulfill a goal, avoid isolated education, and highlights and talk about highlights issues. In the communication process, a sender encodes a message and then, using a medium, could be speech, writing, and talking, sends it to a receiver, which gives appropriate feedback. And the communication process depends mainly from 6 elements: a source, a message, a channel of communication, a receiver, process of encoding and decoding. Another element present in the communicative process is noise, characterized by everything that affects the channel, disturbing the perfect capture of the message. One reason may be that the context is not common among the speaker and the receiver. Another possibility is that the code is unknown to the other person, such as speaking in technical language to a lay receiver. Here, noise is very important, because literally or figuratively, anything that interferes with a message. The primary factor for effective communication is mutual trust between the sender and receiver. In many cases, physical noises or psychological noise and prejudice interfere the transmission of the message. And here are the main barriers in communication: the use of jargon, overcomplicated or unfamiliar terms, emotional barriers and taboos, lack of attention, interest, distractions irrelevant to the receiver, difference in perceiving and viewpoints, physical disabilities, language difference, expectations and prejudice, which may lead to false assumptions or stereotyping, and cultural difference. Post-truth. Post-truth is a term was named Oxford Dictionary's Words of the Year in 2016. Post-truth is a time when objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotional and personal beliefs, as defined by the Oxford University Press. It was the beginning of spreading misinformation and false evidence. The post-truth is fueled by conspiratory theories that question the scientific authority of technical experts and scientific institutions. At the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, ages became even more evident. Countless memes circulated on social media, mocking the elderly, saying that they should stay at home in isolation and the rest of the population could go to the streets. Some authorities even claimed that only the elderly would die for COVID-19, and that was not important, as the country economy needed to stay active. Elderly people were the last to adopt social media. Far beyond the virtual games preferred of parts of the older population, the truth is that technology, which was once a great enemy, has become part of everyday life thanks to apps like WhatsApp, Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, Uber, and online shopping apps. Numerous pharmacological treatments were suggested as therapies against COVID-19, but time has shown that there was no scientific evidence to justify their use. New vaccines have also been the targets of misinformation. Many fake news has discouraged their use, and the anti-vax movement has grown even further. During the worst moments of social isolation, social media played the role of offering social support to patients and families. When searching for similar information and experience, the patients find the opportunity to create or join online communities where they share their own knowledge about any issue. It is how internet bubble works, which is potentialized by social media algorithm. The virtual environment, due to the sensation of anonymity and invisibility, looks like as a safe place for sharing free and spontaneous narratives rich in information. Analyzing the information and verifying the source, however, requires understanding the subject behind the narratives in order to avoid the reproduction of dominant ideologies related to social determinants of risks and damage to health. People can say whatever they want when they are online. Most of the time, rumors and viral posts come from unverified claims. Quickly, at SBGG, we mobilized our associates and organized numerous online activities with great repercussion and participation of the elderly and we seek to use non-violent communication to attempt to gain the trust of unbelievers, which an effective communication strategy. We carried out numerous lives addressing controversial topics, sponsored webinars, and we supported a website to answer doubts and with frequently asked questions. In addition, we allowed anyone to contact us for personal questions. We seek to provide reliable information in an easier and more accessible language for the population, avoiding complex speeches and standard interviews that look like scientific interrogatories. With these actions, we managed to get closer and win the trust of healthcare professionals and facilitates the sharing of doubts, information, and experience through the publication of questions, reports, and reflections. Before the pandemic, our social media was used only for bureaucratic communication, especially for our associates. When we started, we had about 1,000 followers, and today we have more than 30,000 followers in our social medias. The increase in influence of social media was made possible to refer reliable professionals and healthcare services with the ability to provide correct information which could be shared with their family and friends groups. In conclusion, the use of social media can be an ally to overcome misinformation and false scientific evidence. It was possible to perceive that the use of technologies by the elderly was an important ally in the resumption and or adoption of a day-to-day activities during the quarantine period. Due to the pandemic, in less than a year, we advanced the expected 10 years ahead in the adoption of new technologies, which with the population. And here, the positive use of social media, connecting with friends, obtaining information, participating in community groups, perceiving and offering emotional support, learning about current events and cultural issues, finding opportunities for community involvement, and accessing healthcare. And there was a huge increase in using web meetings, telemedicine and shopping apps in these 2 years of pandemic. And here, what do you see? Can you see the spinning moving lines and the sphere floating here in this image? In fact, it is a stable image. It is not in movement. The message is, do not believe in everything you see or what do you think you are seeing in the internet. It can be your brain being fooled. And last but not least, I would like you to invite the Brazilian Congress of Gerontology and Geriatrics from March 23rd to 25th next year, 2023, here in São Paulo. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all for the wonderful presentation. And now we have a time for questions. Okay, thank you for your excellent presentation, Dr. Carlos, Simone, and Vaniá. Well, I have a question to Dr. Vaniá. The COVID pandemic had an impact on the elderly. You speak about the population's reactions in relation to health actions that promoted institutional violence. What tensions you observed as violence?
Oh, thank you, Ivete, for your question. I think that the difficulty of the population in general to adapt at the distancing measures, suspension of face-to-face the activities, and contradictory reactions from the elderly population about actuality doing isolation. But the institutional violence is important because the lack of support for the most vulnerable elderly population. It's important to say too that the principal violence in this period is to the physical violence, psychology violence, and the patrimonial violence. The impacts of the psychologists refer to situations of depression, loss of self-esteem, emotional lack of control, and even the feeling of emotional loss. When the violence occurs, it reflects disputes over positions, domains of no accepting of the conditions of the others, and bring as a consequence, in addition to conflicts of interest, the fragility of social relationships between members of the same group.
Thank you, Dr. Vaniá. And is today we not celebrate, but remember the Day of Violence Against the Elderly. No? Thank you for your answer. Okay, no questions? Well, I have a question to you, Simone. You speak about the reaction of our society made for help the community through the difference ways to take care of the challenge during the pandemic. How you measure the participation of the SBGG in this process?
Thank you for the questions. We saw during the period of the COVID-19 growing in the role of the important role in the SBGG with our society. In different social media, the participation with different institutions of medicines to help guidelines for all the situations, the different situations, like the COVID vaccines, for the people make the first, second, third, and fourth vaccines, for example. So we saw the growing of the SBGG in this important pandemic time.
Thank you. Yes, the participation of SBGG in this process was great and they make the difference. Dr. Carlos participated with the special committee against fake news and COVID. Can you speak about the special committee against COVID?
Yes, thank you, Ivete. It was a committee from Brazilian Medical Society Association, and in this committee there were a lot of different specialized medical societies. Brazilian Society of Geriatric and Gerontology, the Pediatric Association, Infection Disease Association, and it was important to talk with society, the population, to fight against the fake news. Because here in Brazil, we have a negationist president. Yes. That he always make everything against the initiatives against COVID-19, and it was important to talk with the news, television, writing news, to give good information and fight against this fake news. And it was a huge movement from Brazilian medical societies to rearrange and make all these societies against the misinformation that was happening here in Brazil.
Yes, yes. Thank you for your answer. Well, any question more? We have 6 minutes too. Someone wants to make a comment? No? Well, we thank you for the IGG committee for invitation to participate in this great meeting, and we really happy to participate in this symposium. Thank you for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.